Now, Jack Schmitt,
You haven't seen my whale shark picture, have you?
is it on buzzaldrin.com? No, I'm just checking. Or on Facebook. Jack Schmitt, selected as an astronaut in 1965 during the Gemini program. What did you at that point imagine your place in the program would be, and did you ever think you'd end up on the lunar surface?
We'll probably answer the first part, the last part of your question first. I never had any illusion that the only reason I was in the program was because I was a geologist, and that if I was going to get a flight, it would almost certainly be associated with a lunar flight. So I was thinking in those terms all along. And secondly, I felt that the chances were very, very small that I would ever fly. You have to go in with that assumption. I don't know about the rest of these guys, but you make that assumption, then you say, okay, what can I do to make this program successful?
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of my time after pilot training and after helicopter training and going through the general training program that NASA had at the time. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can we best train for actually working on the surface of the moon, both in terms of EVA in a 1/6 gravity environment, which turns out it automatically gives you some foot restraints. Yeah. The moon becomes a golden slipper if you want to look at it that way.
1/6, yeah.
And secondly, what kind of tools would you need in order to explore the moon and make the best use of the time that we had there? And thirdly, how best to train the astronauts who had the highest probability of going to the moon, train them in the kinds of things that would be important to lunar science. Fortunately, George Low, right from more or less the beginning, George Low was the head of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office. He realized that if we're successful in landing on the moon, we're going to be able to do a lot more than just land on the moon and return safely to Earth. And so he put in place, obviously with the agreement of many others, a program of experiments that would be deployed on the moon, of a Block 2 lunar module for the later, longer duration flights. All of those decisions were made before Neil Armstrong ever landed on the moon. And I was deeply involved in trying to make sure all of those initiatives were successful. Early on, after I returned from pilot training, I went to Al Shepard, who was our boss at the time, and suggested that, like all other astronaut training, we bring the geology training in-house, into the astronaut office. And he said, well, if you can convince Jim Lovell to do that on Apollo 13, to take on this kind of more advanced training program that really was a geological simulation program on real geological projects, our locations out in the United States. He said, if you can convince Jim to do it, then sure, have at it. Well, I don't think Al really knew what he was agreeing to at the time, because Jim embraced it enthusiastically, and he and Fred Hayes really set the stage for the geology training program for the later missions. Fortunately for Apollo 11, we had Neil's enthusiasm for collecting samples and looking at rocks and deploying experiments, and that turned out to be matter of fact, just recently I tried to list all of the scientific accomplishments that came just from Apollo 11. If you'd never landed on the moon again, how much of what we know about the moon would we have learned from Apollo 11? And it's quite impressive. It's quite an impressive.
And people forget, and then those of us remember back to then. Remember that little trailer that's back at the I think at the annex out of Dulles at Udvar Hazy now, but where you had Neil and Buzz and Mike Collins, they're in quarantine because the stuff we didn't know what they're bringing back.
We did.
Well, okay, we did. Well,
it was the public health service didn't know what we were bringing back.
Okay, they weren't sure. They were unclear of the concept. But they terrified a nation by quarantining for a few days.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was Dick Nixon outside, Neil and Buzz, I'm not coming in there. All right. Couple of questions. I could get $1 million, but that would be wrong. All those great Nixonian things. Here's something. I think this is probably the second most popular question when we look at questions from the crowd, right up there with how'd you go to the bathroom in space? And I don't know that we need to cover that because really we're eating dessert. But here's one from Karen, and this is just for everybody. And chime in. Were you ever scared? Because anybody looks at this, I mean, people always ask this. I mean, were you scared sitting on flaming projectiles, not knowing, especially when you go off to the moon, not knowing how any of this was going to end, but especially when you're just doing things that no man's done before? Fear, any of you? Or is it just, oh yeah, baby, I fly jets? Don't just all jump in.
We all, everyone who went to the moon is a different individual. We all came back with different feelings, different thoughts, and I think everyone may have a different answer to that question. Personally, I look at, we were so involved, we were so tunnel vision, we were so quite confident. We had the best hardware, the best people supporting us. We wanted to do what we were doing, and we knew we could do it, and do it as good or better than it's ever been done before. I mean, personally, that's the attitude I had. Yet, we all knew we were vulnerable to a host of unknown problems. Apollo 13 may be a good example of that. So apprehension in my life played a big part. Fear, no, but apprehension, yes.
Would anybody ever admit to being terrified? Were you terrified, Dick?
Well, you want to be scared. I made over 100 night carrier landings, and I was scared to death on every damn one of them. Especially when the visibility was about a quarter of a mile.
Yeah, that's right.
Let me,
Charlie?
Let me get it, throw in. Yeah, I had a moment of fear. John and I had been 70 hours on the moon. We were closing up, getting ready to get back in, and we were going to do the Moon Olympics. And 72 was an Olympic year. Munich Olympics were in August, so we were going to do the Moon Olympics in April. And so we had gotten sort of clearance for this. And,
Sort of, yeah. Your tax dollars at work.
Sort of, yeah. And but we were running behind schedule, so John started saying, well, he starts bouncing, Said we were going to do the Moon Olympics and do the high jump, and yeah, said and I started bouncing, and I bounced 2 or 3 times, and then I made a big leap, and when I did, I straightened up, and the backpack weighed as much as I did, so over I went backwards, and that was a fearful moment.
That scared me seeing the video, Charlie.
Yeah, and so I got to admit, I had a moment of fear, but I rolled right, broke my fall, and I was on the surface, my heart was pounding. John came over and helped me up. You okay? And I said, yeah, I think so. And the pressure was good, the pumps were running and everything, and I looked up, and fear turned to embarrassment because the big eye was pointed right at me. And that ended the Moon Olympics. We had one event.
And that was probably the scariest thing. We're getting ahead of ourselves on Apollo, but I'm trying to intersperse some of these questions. Probably the other scary thing was Gene and Jack singing on the moon. That was
horrible.
That was an awful thing. You can find that on YouTube. Showing on the moon one day. Could you guys reprise that? Nah, we'll get to that later on. Okay, here's a question from Rob, and any of you can jump in. This is unusual. What does space smell like? The question is, what does space smell like?
How about the spacecraft? What does it smell like?
Yeah. You don't put one of those little air fresheners you get at the car wash there on the windshield, right? What does space smell like? Okay, before you've been in the Gemini capsule for a few, is there any difference? Is it?
I don't know anyone's ever smelled space. I don't think you can. I think we wouldn't be here if we smelled space. Now, here's again, personal impression. Jack and I played, and I think Buzz and Dick did as well, but we packed a lot of rocks in a vacuum. But we also brought a lot of rocks in the spacecraft. And that's a whole nother story. But I have a vivid smell of spent gunpowder. Now, I don't know whether Jack has it, but spent gunpowder. That's not space.
I think that's what they're getting at in that
That's
question.
what the rocks, that's what
Yeah,
the...
not,
That's
the, not
the
the
du-
void of space, which would have been bad, but
Yeah,
we-
that's the dust, smell,
Yeah.
and the reason it's similar is some of us were talking a little bit informally earlier. In my opinion, this is my hypothesis, okay, is that this dust has been created in a vacuum, so it is highly activated relative to the dust we're used to here on Earth, and that's the same as gunpowder. As soon as you fire gunpowder, that charcoal is highly activated. Now, as it absorbs oxygen and nitrogen from the atmosphere and water, it ceases to be so activated. But initially, your nose has the same reaction. Your olfactory sensors had the same reaction to the lunar dust and the gunpowder.
Wow.
And that's why the smell, I think, and as far as I know, all 12 of us who experienced it inhaled it. Now, I think I was the only one that had, at least briefly, an allergic reaction to it. Not an intense one, but enough to make my turbinate swell up and to give me a husky voice. And then gradually that disappeared, unfortunately.
smells like victory to me.
One thing, I want to bring Ron Evans into this
We're going
conversation.
to do that. In fact, it's a great time
Well,
to...
but this has to do with smell.
Okay, good.
There's a famous picture that Ron took, I think, of himself. I don't know how he did it, because I don't remember taking it. You know, the one with the hydrogen bubble in the salmon salad? We use salmon salad for our experiments, folks. I don't know that, other than John Young. John Young liked the salmon salad, didn't he? Yeah, well, John's an interesting guy.
Dick's over going, what is that? What?
But anyway, the fuel cells that we use to produce water and electricity were outstanding engineering accomplishments. One little problem was that a little bit of hydrogen would always end up in the water. And so when you ingested that hydrogen, eventually it would have to come out. And that was one of the contributors to the smell of space that Charlie was referring to.
I'm now thinking of several stories that I've heard that I cannot share in this august body. One involving Gene and Tom Stafford up at the Charles Schultz Museum. I won't even go there right now. Now, you mentioned about Ron Evans, and this, you didn't even know how great your timing is till now, Jack. This is awesome. We're going to bring up, so I think this is a real special treat because we want to honor Ron Evans, a command module pilot from Apollo 17, and we're getting to the Apollo chapter here. But Jan Evans is here tonight. That's the widow of Ron Evans, and we're just so thrilled to have her here tonight, to hear from her. We're going to ask Dottie Duke, Charlie's wife. These are the wives who are here on base with us tonight, because you never get to hear from the wives. They're the ones who are, you talk about, I mean, I know what my wife does. She runs everything that's worth running at our house. You can imagine how it is with these guys. So let's bring up Jan Evans and Dottie Duke right now to join us on the panel here, all right? Welcome, ladies. Thank you for classing up the joint.
Thank you.